All right, we have been listening to President Trump's news conference on the final day of the G7 summit in France. The president's for speaking for over an hour, claiming that the Iran agreement will be signed shortly, potentially tomorrow or Friday. He said that he has sent a copy to Israel. The president also saying that maritime traffic in the Strait of Hormuz has increased substantially, but warning that if a deal isn't done in 60 days, the U.S. will, in his words, go back to bombing. The president, though, not providing all that much substance in the details of this agreement between the United States and Iran. He also said that he does not think at this point that it's necessary for him to sign this document, although he did leave open the possibility that that may occur. Let's bring in NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez. He is in Geneva right now, traveling with the president. Gabe, at the same time that this was happening, we also had some other news happening as the senior White House officials outlined the details of this agreement between Iran and the United States. You were on that call. It was embargoed. We were not allowed to report it until the president was done speaking. Talk to us a little bit about what you learned in that call, because this is the most substance that we've gotten yet in terms of this deal.
Ryan, it truly was remarkable to hear senior U.S. officials speaking about the details of this memorandum of understanding simultaneously when the president was holding his news conference. But you're right, a senior U.S. official actually read the text of this memorandum of understanding aloud on this call. And I'm going through it now. What I can tell you is that the main point that the administration wants to emphasize is that Iran, as part of this MOU, has agreed not to produce nor procure a nuclear weapon. Of course, that was something that Iran had previously agreed to under previous agreements, the one signed under the Obama administration, that it would only have its nuclear program for civilian purposes. But along with what we've been hearing with the administration when it comes to reopening the Strait of Hormuz and ending the U.S. naval blockade, some of the most controversial points here will be point 10. By the way, this memorandum of understanding, senior U.S. officials confirmed, does have 14 points. Point 10, it says the United States of America undertakes that immediately upon the signing of this MOU, the U.S. Department of Treasury will issue waivers for the export of Iranian crude oil, petroleum products, and derivatives. So basically, the thing that will kick in immediately once this is formally signed is sanctions relief for Iran. That has drawn widespread skepticism from even some of the president's allies, some Republicans who are concerned that you're essentially rewarding Iran up front. A senior U.S. official on this call defended this sanctions relief by saying that essentially they'll be able to keep better track of any oil that Iran is selling to other countries, that'll have more visibility for it. And that's the defense that the administration gave. Point 11, the U.S. also undertakes to make more fully available the use of frozen or restricted funds and assets of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, such funds, whether retained to the original account or transferred, shall be made fully usable for payment to any beneficiary designed by the central bank of Iran. So basically, Ryan, the administration is laying out for the first time, reading this 14-point plan, this memorandum of understanding, that it claims that some of its points will only be given to Iran and act as rewards if they fully uphold their commitments as part of this memorandum of understanding. But Ryan, this might be seen by people who are hardliners here that the U.S. is giving up too much to Iran up front. The administration is arguing no, that is not the case, that this is only setting up this 60-day window to talk about specifics of the nuclear program. But again, we are learning for the first time the specifics of this 14-point plan that senior U.S. officials read on this call just as the president was speaking.
Yeah, and Gabe, let's drill down on that, because when you talk about the potential of criticism that could come particularly from Iran hawks, these are supporters of the president, supporters of his plan to invade Iran. One of the huge criticisms of the JCPOA, which was the original agreement that the Obama administration had hatched, was a similar provision, the unfreezing of existing Iranian assets. It wasn't necessarily direct payments from the United States government to Iran. That was heavily criticized by Donald Trump at the time. It's been heavily criticized by the administration even before this conflict began. But it does seem as though that's exactly what they're planning to do this time around in terms of bringing this deal. It's not about the United States handing over U.S. dollars, but it's about unfreezing assets that already belong to Iran.
Right. And look, that is a criticism that we do expect to hear in the coming days as this memorandum of understanding is dissected. But what the administration is trying to argue that it's it's only if Iran meets certain benchmarks, although it hasn't specified what those benchmarks are. The president today, in his news conference that he just had, and also previous events throughout the day at the G7, he tried to argue that he is very willing to resume bombing Iran if it doesn't uphold its commitments, if he's not happy with how this is implemented, Ryan.
Okay, Gabe Gutierrez, thank you for your reporting and thanks for being on that call. Let's go now to our chief White House correspondent, Garrett Haake. He is traveling with the president. He was in the room. And Garrett, let's talk about the question that you asked President Trump, which I think is a significant part of this. He has been insistent that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, but one of the key sticking points here was, would he allow a nuclear program of any kind to allow them to generate power or use it for their own domestic needs? You pressed him on that, and I think his answer was pretty revealing. Give us your take.
Yeah. I think so, too, Ryan. And he didn't say no. I mean, look, overall, I found the president to be incredibly conciliatory toward Iran, both in tone and in specific content. It sounded at times like he was making a pitch for investment in Iran more than describing a document which end a war that he believes the U.S. was victorious in. On nuclear enrichment or on the idea of having a nuclear program, he did not say that they couldn't do it. He suggested that he doesn't think it's necessary, but he didn't say no. He basically said it would come down to common sense. Likewise, before that, I asked him about Iran's ballistic missile program. Remember, one of the 4 goals of Operation Epic Fury, which we heard from White House officials and the president dozens and dozens of times, was to destroy Iran's ballistic missiles and their capabilities to make more. Now the president says not only is that off the table, he thinks Iran should be able to keep ballistic missiles because their neighbors have them. He told me that they won't perhaps have as many as some of their neighbors, but he's not going to go about destroying them or even arguing that they should be decommissioned or removed. That's probably not going to sit particularly well with Gulf Arab allies in this conflict, or with Israel, which I think is another subplot from this whole press conference here. The president, who at the beginning described Israel as a joint partner, continued for the second day in a row now to really strongly criticize Israel and the manner in which they've conducted their own war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so I think really for people who were, if you sort of jumped from February till now, this could be considered head-spinning, the degree in which the president was now sounding conciliatory about Iran and their future and condemning the tactics of Israel, who started this conflict as our day one joint venture partner, as the president described it.
Yeah, and I wonder, too, Garrett, just your overall impression about the way the president has described this agreement, this kind of path forward. A couple of days ago, the White House was basically declaring that this was the end of the war. Now it seems as it's kind of entering into a new, maybe more solid ceasefire. It doesn't seem to nearly have the same sort of concrete declaration of the end of the war that maybe it had a few days ago.
Yeah, not at all, Ryan. I found the president had sort of a lack of emotional connection to this ceasefire. I mean, he said really 2 things out loud that, you know, conspiracy theorists or skeptics have kind of mumbled about or talked about online. First, that, you know, part of the reason he responds the way he does to some of these things is for the markets, that the stock market always reacts favorably when he talks about a peace deal as opposed to threatens more bombing. He said he's well aware of that fact, and it clearly influenced some of the way that he's talked about this deal. Second, right there at the end, he said, you know, what a lot of people have sort of been whispering about, this idea that if things go well, he'll take the credit. If it goes poorly, he'll blame J.D. Vance and resume the bombing. There was not a question asked, and I think it's one of the outstanding ones that we still have, is, you know, when do the American military forces that are arrayed around Iran get to come home? Are they going to be sitting there for months and months and months on end to ensure compliance here? Because the compliance structure, as the president described it, is basically more bombing at a time and place of his choosing. That doesn't say to me the war is over. That says to me the ceasefire is extended. The president wants to keep the talks and the stock market rally alive.
All right, Garrett Haake, terrific work inside the room, and that leads us to that topic about military intervention and how long the military could be in the region. Let's bring in our senior correspondent, senior Pentagon correspondent, I should say, Courtney Cubie. As Garrett said, Courtney, we heard the president say that the U.S. could still bomb Iran if it doesn't adhere to the agreement. What does that say about the military posture, and what could it look like moving forward? I would imagine it doesn't mean that these ships are coming home anytime soon.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like anything is going to happen while the U.S. and Iran continue this, I guess, next phase of negotiations for some sort of a final agreement. But there is tucked inside of this what the senior administration officials released that Gabe was referencing. Tucked in there is a reference to the fact that the U.S. military will draw back its presence from the region. That is a very vague statement, Ryan. It's not really clear if that means. You can see, look on screen right there. You see this map here. The USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group and the Abraham Lincoln. They're down at sort of the base of the Gulf of Oman there. They've been enforcing the naval blockade that will immediately be lifted once this final agreement is signed on Friday, according to what we now have learned from senior administration officials. It's not clear, though, will they just pull back a little bit during the course of these final negotiations, or are we talking about decreasing the overall U.S. military presence in the region? I bring that up because this has been something that Iran has wanted for decades. One of the arguments that they have had for getting involved in wars like the war in Iraq and providing funding and training and money and everything to these proxy groups is with an ultimate goal of pushing the U.S. out of the region. If, in fact, they have attained that from this agreement, that would be a huge strategic win for Iran overall. A couple other things. Gabe spoke about the sanctions relief that would immediately kick in. Again, the naval blockade that's been in effect now for weeks. That, according to the latest memorandum of understanding, will also immediately lift that naval blockade. Just for perspective here, the U.S. has turned around more than 140 ships during the course of that blockade, and they have disabled at least 9, meaning they have taken strikes, shot Hellfires and other munitions into the engine room of a number of these ships to disable them when they appear to be in violation of the blockade. There was one case recently where the U.S. fired on a ship that had a crew of Indian civilians on it, Indian mariners, and at least 3 were killed. We heard from President Trump met with Indian Prime Minister Modi this morning. There was no mention of that, but that has become a diplomatic issue between the two countries. Another thing that deals with the U.S. military as part of this agreement is the U.S. will and Iran will ensure that maritime traffic will be back at pre-war levels within about 30 days. And then it mentions that there is the possibility that Iran could have placed mines in the Strait of Hormuz that could impact that timeline. Well, we know, according to officials we've been speaking with on a near daily basis, just trying to keep a sense of whether Iran has placed mines, that the U.S. hasn't been finding them. They've not been pulling them out of the water. But there are still traffic lanes, maritime lanes, throughout that Strait of Hormuz that the U.S. has not been able to clear. So that still could be an issue going forward. Notably, in the language, it talks about the possibility of Iran demining some of those maritime traffic lanes. The U.S. destroyed all of Iran's mining vessels. So I'm not really sure how Iran could accomplish that, or they would look to the U.S. and potentially other partners, as President Trump talked about other nations being willing to be involved in the Strait of Hormuz going forward. Finally, the other thing that I was really struck by in this, Ryan, is President Trump talking about missiles. Garrett touched on that. It was based off of his question. I was really struck by the fact that the president said missiles aren't the problem here. You'll recall that early on, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he gave this explanation for why the U.S. was engaged in this war, arguing that the Iranian conventional shield, including missiles and drones, provided an opportunity for Iran to potentially pursue a nuclear weapon. So basically, Iran could build a nuclear weapon and use their conventional shield of ballistic missiles and drones and other capabilities to defend against any kind of threat to that nuclear program going forward. One of the main reasons that they went in, allegedly, was to destroy that missile program, to destroy the drone program. It is very, very notable to hear President Trump go back on that point now. That was one of the most coherent arguments that we got early on from the Trump administration about why the U.S. or how they believed that they could really disrupt any kind of a nuclear program was by going after Iran's conventional capabilities. It now appears that they have backed off of that as one of their strategic goals here, Ryan.
Okay, terrific context from everything, Courtney. Thank you for all of that. Let's go to the region now and get a sense of what the response is there. We're bringing NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley. He's in Tel Aviv. So, Matt, the one thing that we haven't talked about in the context of this, after hearing from the president and getting the details of this memorandum of understanding, is how Israel plays into this. We only know that Israel now has access to this document, which they didn't initially. And we still know that this conflict that they are engaged in with Lebanon continues to be a lingering issue. How could that impact the way things are where you're standing now? And should we expect that this means the conflict with Lebanon and Israel will also come to an end soon?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the gaping flaws to everything that has led up to this announcement, these negotiations, and now this memorandum of understanding is that Israel, which had participated and some would say had led the effort to start this fight against Iran back in late February, that they were nowhere to be seen during the negotiations. There were several days until apparently just tonight that the Israelis were actually given a copy of this memorandum of understanding. It doesn't sound like they're going to be participating in the signing ceremonies tomorrow or Friday. I've reached out to the Prime Minister's office right after we heard President Trump say that he had given over a copy of that MOU to the Israelis. They said that there's been no real change in that situation, so it sounds as though they haven't heard that the Israeli side has been given a copy of the MOU. But what we've heard from the president tonight is enough to really rankle a lot of Israelis who had been investing a lot in this war. We heard from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been facing terrible criticism over the past several weeks about what looks like the fate of a joint American and Israeli effort that now looks like Israel has been the big loser. The real flaw here is that while Prime Minister Netanyahu had very little involvement in any of these negotiations, he is in the best position out of anybody to completely undermine and destroy the ceasefire even before it emerges across the region. It's because of the fighting in Lebanon that this ceasefire has been stillborn on several occasions over the past couple months and weeks. We heard President Trump taking Prime Minister Netanyahu to task, calling him on some occasions expletives, and just today, basically very gently, more so than he had over the past couple of days, chiding the prime minister for the way that the Lebanese military has been fighting in Lebanon against Hezbollah. And once again, ruminating that the leader of Syria might be able to do a better job. But it's those questions of ballistic missiles that we heard from Garrett that really is going to vex so many Israelis who faced all of that retribution from Iran in the form of those ballistic missiles over the past year.
Okay, Matt Bradley in Tel Aviv, thank you for that. Let's quickly go back to senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez in Geneva. And to Matt's point, Gabe, based on what you heard as the administration outlined the details in this memorandum of understanding, how could it impact Israel?
Well, certainly, Ryan, look, I asked the senior U.S. official on this call specifically about Israel and this idea that Prime Minister Netanyahu had not been given the text of this memorandum of understanding. This senior official said that Netanyahu had not asked for it, but that the Israelis had been briefed on all of this throughout the process. So it may be a technicality. Maybe they didn't send the exact text of the agreement, but according to this U.S. official, Israel was briefed. Now, Matt was right that President Trump has been increasingly frustrated with Prime Minister Netanyahu and has taken him to task for his handling of the Lebanon situation. But this U.S. official said that the Israelis were somewhat on board, and while they were skeptical, they were looking forward to what the U.S. was able to accomplish here.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.